Hot Talk, Cold Science, Global Warming's Unfinished Debate by legendary atmospheric scientist Dr. S. Fred Singer was a great book when it first appeared in 1997. Its second edition in 1999 was even better, and now its third edition, with which Dr. Singer had assistance from two Cornwall Alliance scholars, is greater still. On this edition of From the Stacks, University of Missouri atmospheric scientist Dr. Anthony Lupo joins us to discuss this newly released third edition of Hot Talk, Cold Science. Stick with us to find out how you can receive a free copy. Welcome. I'm Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We are a network of evangelical Christians, scientists, economists, policy wonks, theologians, philosophers, and ethicists, all working together to educate the public and policymakers on three things, together, simultaneously, and intertwined. They are biblical earth stewardship, or what we also call godly dominion. That's men and women working together to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. The second area is economic development for the very poor around the world through a combination of social institutions, that is private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law, as well as access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy, especially in the form of electricity, without which no society has ever grown out of poverty or can stay out of poverty. And then the third area of our work is the gospel of Jesus Christ, along with the biblical worldview, theology, and ethics that come along with it. So the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a nonprofit ministry, and we are able to work because of the support of people just like you. And in fact, for the month of February, we are delighted to be able to offer a free copy of a wonderful book, the third edition of Fred Singer's magnificent book, Hot Talk, Cold Science, Global Warming's Unfinished Debate. This third edition just came off the press last month. It's published by the Independent Institute, and Dr. Singer had the assistance of Dr. David Legates, who's a senior fellow and advisor of the Cornwall Alliance, and Dr. Anthony Lupo, who is a contributing writer and advisor for the Cornwall Alliance. In preparing this third edition, Dr. Singer died last spring at age, I believe it was 96, and yet this book has just come out, and it's a tremendous book. To request your free copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, enter Hot Talk Cold Science or promo code 21-02, and we will be glad to send you a free copy when you make a donation of literally any size and request it before the end of February. So this book is by truly a legendary atmospheric scientist, Dr. Fred Singer. It was great when it first appeared in 1997, second edition 99, even better, and now this third edition is available. And tonight we have Dr. Anthony Lupo to discuss the newly released book with us. So stick with us for what I'm convinced is going to be exciting stuff. Tony, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Tell us quickly a little bit about your background and activities as a climate scientist.
Well, I'm glad to be with you here, Cal, tonight. And my background is fairly simple. I've done some research in climate dynamics, and that is how climate varies, how it's been changing regionally here in the Midwest, but also globally. because my main area of research is jet stream dynamics. And of course, I've also contributed to some of the efforts like the IPCC. I was a reviewer and contributor to that publication. I've been a reviewer since the second uh, assessment report.
And the second assessment report came out in, what was that, 1996, was it?
That would have
95?
been 1995, yes. It's been a long
95.
time.
And the IPCC, for those people who are not familiar with the initials, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So some folks think that people who are skeptical about dangerous man-made global warming are all outside the UN and the IPCC. Well, that's not true. And Tony is an example of those who are inside, who nonetheless are pretty skeptical of the ideas of dangerous man-made climate change. So, Tony, you had the opportunity to work with Dr. Singer on preparing the third edition of Hot Talk Cold Science. What makes it so great, and what can people expect to learn from it?
Well, as a book, I think it's an honest appraisal of the climate change debate and discussion. It captures the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. The good, of course, is the current state of the science, and folks can learn about that. They can learn about how the temperatures are changing with respect to time, and they can learn a little bit about the shortcomings of model projections, and they can also learn about some of the scandals that we'll cover later, like the ClimateGate scandal.
Okay. Now, some people will wonder just who Fred Singer was and whether he has any credibility as a climate scientist. One could do a deep dive about his amazing career, but I'll try to keep this brief. Fred Singer was truly one of America's most prominent physicists. He received his PhD in physics from Princeton in 1948. He designed the first satellite instrument for measuring atmospheric ozone and was a principal developer of scientific and weather satellites. He served as vice chairman of the National Advisory Committee on Oceans and Atmospheres, as chief scientist for the U.S. Department of Transportation, as deputy assistant administrator at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, as deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of the Interior, first dean of the School of Environmental and Planetary Sciences at the University of Miami, first director of the U.S. Weather Service Satellite Service, the director of the Center for Atmospheric and Space Physics at the University of Maryland, research physicist in the Upper Atmosphere Rocket Program of Johns Hopkins University. You might almost think that we were talking about 5 or 6 different people here, not just one. Dr. Singer was also a research fellow of the Independent Environmental Policy Project, founder of the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, and professor emeritus of environmental science at the University of Virginia, where he taught from 1971 to 1994. Among his many honors are the White House Special Commendation, the Gold Medal Award for the Department of Commerce, and the first Science Award from the British Interplanetary Society. He was also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And best of all, for my sake anyway, Fred was simply a kind and generous human being, and I'm grateful to be able to say that he was my friend. So, Tony, tell us about your own relationship with Fred Singer.
Well, as a grad student, when you look at the accomplishments of Fred Singer, as I was a grad student, as his career was winding down, he was one of the giants that you want to meet at a conference, or at least go to watch talk. Again, he's so accomplished that meeting him was an honor at these meetings, at these conferences. I got a chance to work with him through the NIPCC process and through his science and environmental policy project. So I was communicating with him about these issues. But yeah, I met him once when, as his career was winding down and mine was gearing up. And ever since then, we communicated about skeptic issues.
Okay. Well, to put it simply, it's ridiculous to try to write Fred Singer off as a crackpot, a climate denier, a science denier, or any of the other ways that climate alarmists tend to refer to him. Is that not right, Tony?
Oh, absolutely. That's ridiculous. And of course, he's not alone in that writing off process. There's been other very powerful scientists in our field that
Yeah.
when they're outed as a denier, they kind of write him off. And Fred was one of those. And unfortunately, that's one of the tactics they use to diminish the stature of prominent skeptics.
Yeah. Good old argumentum ad hominem abusive, just attack the person rather
Absolutely.
than really dealing with the arguments. Well, you're a contributing writer and advisor for the Cornwall Alliance, and you were joined by Dr. David Legates, one of our advisors and senior fellows, in working with Fred to prepare this third revised and expanded edition of Hot Talk Cold Science. How did you and David contribute to this?
Well, David and I were invited to write the afterward chapter and to review the information and to make sure that everything was sourced properly. And quite frankly, when Fred wrote some, it was very easy to review because he's very good at making sure that he supports whatever he wrote with good references and peer-reviewed material. So the job wasn't too hard. And then, of course, I suggested a couple wording changes here and there, and then David wrote the bulk of the afterword, and I contributed to some of the wording on that as well.
Okay. Now, Fred was heavily involved in the early years of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and he writes at some length about that in Hot Talk Cold Science. Tony, in chapter 4, Fred wrote that the IPCC misled the public by asserting, among other things, a fake consensus of scientists, corruption of the peer review process, and a change to the IPCC's second assessment report that departed from the actual scientific evidence underlying that report. Uh, can you enlarge on those for us a little bit?
Absolutely. In the second report, what was done is that the materials that were given for peer review contained statements that said material will be inserted later or figure will be inserted later, in addition to the material that we had. Now, that's not true peer review. Peer review is looking at everything as it is. And so, fortunately, that practice was halted in later assessment reports. But for the second report, that was a big issue. And then again, the final, the summary for policymakers is supposed to give a brief rundown of the science so that the policymakers don't have to go through thousands of pages of research. And it wasn't quite faithful to what the science was saying, and folks kind of exaggerated the effects of climate change.
Yeah. Okay. Now, in chapter 5, and I'm just going to kind of walk us through some of the bigger parts of the book here. In chapter 5, Fred discusses what he calls the hockey stick deception. What's that all about? I mean, how did hockey come into all this?
Well, if you look at Michael Mann's construction of the climate from about 1000 AD to the present, it looks literally like a hockey stick. You have 900 years of basically very little change, which represents the shaft of the hockey stick, and then the 20th century rises very abruptly, and that's the blade. Um, The problem with this was some shoddy analysis in terms of the numerical methods used and an over reliance on one particular tree uh, that responds more to CO2 content than it does to temperature. And to my mind, also, I would also, in my opinion, say that this is problematic anytime you're trying to blend instrument data with proxy data. And proxy data are anything that's used to approximate what climate conditions were like when we didn't have instruments, such as tree rings. So just some bad analysis, over reliance on one particular tree, and
Yeah.
to my mind, mixing of data sets, and that produces a bad analysis.
Okay. And yet, that hockey stick graph was used 3 different times in the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It made it into newspaper stories all over the world. It became really one of the most widely used ways of arguing that we were watching something that was just utterly unprecedented historically. And then, as it turned out, because of the kinds of failures that you just mentioned, that was pretty well debunked. And lo and behold, the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, came back into being, so to speak. And we realized that what had been happening in the last century or so was, in fact, not unusual. Well, in chapter 6 of Hot Talk Cold Science, Fred Singer writes about the ClimateGate scandal. Explain that to our viewers. What was ClimateGate?
Well, ClimateGate was a dump of emails in 2009. It was November, as I recall, from the
Yeah.
Climate Research Unit over in Britain. And in these emails, there were several communications between prominent scientists about rigging the peer review process, about being off on papers that were critical of the consensus, if you will. And also, there were emails that were discussing numerical trickeries, if you will, to hide some of these warm and cool periods that existed during the last millennium. Again, the hockey
Mm-hmm.
stick, as you pointed out, gave the impression that climate didn't change naturally over the last millennium, when in fact it really did.
Okay. Okay, our friends, I would remind you that we would be delighted to send you a free copy of this wonderful, nearly 300-page hardback book, Hot Talk Cold Science, Global Warming's Unfinished Debate by legendary atmospheric scientist Dr. S. Fred Singer, with assistance from David Legates and Anthony Lupo, Tony being our guest on the program tonight. To request your free copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button. As you fill out a donation of literally any size, no matter how small, when you come to the comments field, just write in Hot Talk Cold Science or promo code 20-01, and we will be delighted to send you a free copy, and 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. This is our offer through the end of the month of February, as long as our supply lasts. So back to discussing the book. Tony, the first part of the book, in 6 chapters, focuses primarily on the history of how climate change, or global warming, came to be the boogeyman and controversy it is today. The second part, in 9 chapters, addresses what science really says: the unreliable surface temperature record, the gap between observed temperatures and climate models, the possibility that adding CO2 to the atmosphere could actually lead to cooling rather than warming, the failure of sea level rise to accelerate as the world is warmed, the rise of the environmental movement and the competition between Malthusians and cornucopians, the benefits of modest warming, and the comparative risks and benefits of mitigation, that is, trying to curb global warming, versus adaptation. learning how to live with it. So let's dive into some of that. In chapter 7, Dr. Singer discusses what science really says and treats, among other topics, the temperature record, severe storms, heat waves, droughts, and coral reefs. Can you summarize the findings on those topics, starting with the temperature record?
Yes, of course. And with the surface temperature record, Dr. Singer points out that some of the more current records are not that the temperature instruments are not sited very well. In other words, they're placed in a bad spot with respect to corrupting sources like heat islands and things like that. I can give you the example of a current station here in Missouri, St. Louis, the Lambert Airport. In 1926, when Lambert Airport opened, it was a rural site. Today, it's an urban site, and you're going to see that. You're going to see that in the temperature record, and that's not isolated to St. Louis, of course. Now, in the United States, we have better practices, and so if you look at our surface record compared to those of other countries, it's not as severe, but still, that the sighting of instruments is a problem. And that's, of course, why the surface record is rising faster than the satellite record. The satellite record shows a less severe trend in warming. Now, when you talk about things like severe storms, we don't see any increase in hurricane activity across the globe. In the Atlantic Ocean basin, we have seen an increase, but we've seen corresponding decreases elsewhere around the globe. When you look at tornado occurrences in the United States, we have seen a large rise in those, but that's due to the better radars that we have, better network of observations, and quite frankly, everybody and their uncle wants to get a picture of a tornado nowadays. But
Yeah, yeah,
but but
yeah.
again, the rise is due more to technology rather than any
Yeah,
kind of climatological trend that we can identify
yeah.
just yet.
A few weeks ago, we had Neil Frank, the former director of the National Hurricane Center, on the program with us. And Neil pointed out the various different technological changes that have allowed us to detect and decide to name storms that we wouldn't have detected at all 50, 60 years ago, and that we probably wouldn't have decided to name as little as 20 or 30 years ago. And as a result, when we hear, for example, that 2020 was a record-breaking year with 33 named storms, it turns out that if you really compare apples and apples, 2020 with say 1933, looking at the kinds of things that were detectable with the same technology, and looking at the same criteria for deciding whether to name a storm or not, turns out that 2020 was in fact significantly lower than 1933. So, I think what we've seen there is just what you just mentioned and what Fred Singer mentions in Hot Talk Cold Science. Well, what about heat waves and droughts? Is there any significant increase in the frequency or intensity of those as we've seen some global warming over the last, say, 50 years or so?
Well, we're not seeing an increase in the intensity of heat waves or the number of them. We are seeing a decrease in the number of cold waves, but that's probably a good thing because humans don't
Yes.
do as well with cold as with heat. So, the news is not all that bad with respect to these phenomena.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, in one of the books that Pat Michaels, very fine climatologist, edited, I read years ago, cold snaps kill about 10 times as many people per day as do heat waves. So we should be really glad when cold snaps diminish. And even if heat waves increased just as much, we'd see a decline in human mortality. But the fact is that we haven't seen any great increase in the heat waves. Well, what about coral reefs? Some people are saying that global warming is causing die-off in coral reefs.
Yes, they're saying that the die-off in coral reefs is happening because of ocean acidification. And Fred tackles that in the book as well and shows that these things are not occurring due to human activities.
Okay. And chapter 8 is titled The Unreliable Surface Temperature Record. You've already addressed that a little bit. I would just quickly add that Pat Michaels and Ross McKittrick, clear back in 2007, I believe it was, published a major paper in which they demonstrated that probably on the order of half of the apparent global warming since about 1950 was attributable not to actually anything globally going on, but rather to urban heat island effect, to just simply what's happening in the way of warming of cities, though there isn't any particularly great warming going on in the globe as a whole. Now, chapter 9 then discusses the gap between observed temperatures and those predicted by climate models, the basis of climate alarmists' demand that we spend trillions of dollars trying to stop global warming. What's the problem of model projections not matching observations? And how serious is it?
Well, recently we've shown that there are some peer review papers that have shown that models are projecting too much warming and that the observed warming since the 1990s till now is in the lower range of the envelope that models project. Okay, and models are limited in their capability to replicate weather and climate. That's why forecasts are sometimes bad, even a few days out, and models suffer from a couple problems. Our inability to have enough measurements, our inability to represent the numerical methods correctly, and our inability to represent the physics of climate correctly. And it's that last one that's the biggest problem. And Fred talks about this in the book, but the biggest problem is the ability to represent what we call convection, or that's represented by cumulus clouds or cumulonimbus clouds, and precipitation. Those are the two things that we can really only guess at empirically in models. And until we get that right, climate modeling is going to be a very dangerous endeavor.
Yeah, in fact, in the 2001 third assessment report, the IPCC said, and I'm quoting from memory here, so I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that because the climate system is a coupled nonlinear chaotic system, it is in fact impossible to predict future temperature, future global
Oh,
temperature.
absolutely, absolutely. And of course,
And yet,
that's why I choose my words carefully about predict versus project, because what
yeah,
climate models are actually doing is projecting a future
yeah,
scenario. Yeah.
which is a distinction in words that I think often doesn't get appreciated very much by the public, by journalists, by politicians. And I wish that scientists who do appreciate that distinction in words would more frequently point it out for the public, for the journalists and the politicians. Yeah. Um, Something flitted through my mind a moment ago, suggested by what you said. Trying to retrieve it, but it's not coming at the moment. Let's just move on. Uh, let's see. Chapter 10 is titled "Does CO2 Lead to Cooling?" I found that particularly interesting because it's the one point at which Fred really does seem to suggest something quite different from the truly mainstream climate science. What's he up to there? How could CO2, a greenhouse gas that slows the escape of heat from Earth's surface out to space, actually lead to cooling rather than warming?
Well, Fred is a very intelligent man, and he, and before I get into this, I'll preface it by saying that even he cautions in the book that he thinks this may be the case, and it might
Correct.
not be. But
Yeah.
it turns out that as a greenhouse gas, CO2 will saturate fairly quickly, which means the more CO2 that you add, the less incremental warming it's going to cause. And it's also related to pressure. And up in the higher parts of the atmosphere, the pressure is much lower, and and in the stratosphere, CO2 will emit more radiation into space, and in order to compensate for that loss, it must borrow the heat from the troposphere, leading to a little bit of cooling. So he says that if we add too much, we might get a cooling effect.
Okay, so it would be that in the atmosphere as a whole, from sea level all the way out to, on the verge of space, in the atmosphere as a whole, we might have warming from more CO2. But in the troposphere, which is where most of us live, we could actually see a little bit of cooling because some of the heat that normally would stay there gets transported up into the stratosphere instead, because up there might be cooling going on that gets compensated by that rising of heat out of the troposphere. Right? Have I got it about right?
Yep, you've got the essence of it. You've got the essence of it in a thumbnail. So that's good.
Okay. Okay. And as you pointed out, Fred is not saying this is for sure. He's saying this could happen. It could be happening. We're not sure. We're not able at this point yet to measure it, and our ability to model how the whole thing works hasn't reached the point yet where we can be very confident about it. That does remind me of the thought that that flitted through my mind a little bit ago, when you were talking about the complexity of the climate system and how there are just so many things about it that we do not know. Very often, I will encounter people who will say, "It's look, it's basic physics. You add an infrared absorbing gas to the atmosphere, and it absorbs some heat that's headed out away towards space, and it re-radiates that heat spherically, which means that some of it's coming back down toward the surface, and therefore you must wind up with warming." And they say that's basic physics. And as I usually try to respond to that, I say, yeah, but basic physics also tells us that if you drop a rock and a feather at the same moment from the same height, they're going to hit the floor at the same moment too, uh, unless they're in air instead of a vacuum. And if the wind's blowing, the feather might blow up into a tree and get caught and never come down. In other words, reality is a whole lot more complex than basic physics. And the basic physics claim about global warming is simply a huge oversimplification and a very naive understanding of what the climate system is really like. I've heard it said by various climate scientists that the climate system is a whole lot more complicated than rocket science, and indeed that the climate system is probably the most complex system we've ever studied, with the possible exceptions of the human brain and DNA. So we don't want to think that the climate system is just very, very simple thing. Well, chapter 11, Tony, deals with sea level rise. Why do many people, including government officials, think this is the most terrifying thing about global warming? And what does the scientific evidence really say about it, as Fred summarizes it in Hot Talk, Cold Science?
Well, Fred shows that the sea level rise is not accelerating as folks believe. And of course, if you listen to folks like Al Gore, he talks about 20-foot sea level rises by the year 2100. And even the current version of the IPCC report, the fifth assessment report and the sixth assessment report, don't go that far. I mean, they only go to a meter or less. But of course, sea level rise is the big bugaboo because of all the economic activity that takes place in coastal areas. Like it or
Yeah,
not, people choose to live in coastal areas because they're more pleasant places to live.
yeah. And yet, frankly, we talked a little bit about adaptation a while ago. If people think in terms of adaptation, it's really pretty easy to adapt to sea level rise. The Dutch have been doing it for about 500 years. Uh, and during much of that time, they were extremely poor compared with today. And yet they were able to build dikes that have been able to control the sea quite well. Well, turning to another subject, for literally thousands of years, humans have feared overpopulation, especially since Thomas Robert Malthus first published his essay on population in 1798. Many people have thought there's a really simple relationship between human population, on the one hand, and resource supplies, including food and environmental quality, on the other hand. More people means fewer resources and a dirtier environment. Having written a book on population, resources, and the environment that challenges this Malthusian perspective, Prospects for Growth, a biblical view of population, resources, and the future, which is available through the Cornwall Alliance's online store, I was particularly interested and a little surprised to find Fred addressing the subject in Chapter 12, Malthusians versus Cornucopians. Tell us a bit about that chapter, Tony.
Well, in that chapter, he highlights the Malthusian arguments, which are largely negative. They look at the Earth's resources as finite. These are the same folks who look at the economy as finite. And so that the more people that you add uh, just takes more resources, leaves less resources and less economic activity per person, and they just have a negative view of the possibilities for the future. They're the same folks that believed that our oil resources were going to run out 10, 20 years ago. And they just have a negative view of the future. And Fred talks about the Kuznets curve, I think, in that chapter, or it's either in that one or
Yeah.
chapter 13, where he shows that yes, as a society grows, environmental degradation can happen, but then as you get more affluent, the environment actually gets better because you develop better and cleaner technologies, you develop more efficient way of doing things. So again, it's just a optimist versus pessimist kind of outlook on things.
Yeah. And I think, frankly, that the optimistic outlook on these things is much better supported both theoretically and empirically. If we look, for example, at the inflation adjusted price of all extractive resources, that's things that we take out of the earth, whether minerals or vegetables or animals, the long-term inflation adjusted price of all of those is downward. But price is a measure of scarcity. The more scarce something is, the higher its price will be. So if the price is falling, the scarcity has to be declining. That is, the resource you have in mind must be getting more abundant, not less. And even more important than that direct price is the relationship between the average human wage and the resources. And when we look at the long-term trend in the cost of resources per worker hour, we see that they have declined hugely, most of them way over 99% over the last couple of centuries. And of course, the fascinating question is, why is this so? After all, we're using resources. Why are we not running out? The reason is, as Julian Simon pointed out in his book, The Ultimate Resource, and as I argued in my book, Prospects for Growth, human beings make resources. There really are no natural resources. There are raw materials, but resources are the result of the application of the human mind and human uh, physical ability to raw materials, and we get better and better at doing more and more with less and less. And as a result, we're not running out of resources. They're becoming more and more abundant, even as our population grows and as our wealth grows as well. Well, Tony, chapter 13 discusses some benefits of both warming and increasing atmospheric CO2 concentration. Most people seem to think that warming is bad and CO2 is a pollutant. And so it's bad to see global warming and it's bad to see CO2 concentration in the atmosphere rising. Fred Singer disagrees on both counts. He thinks that there are some real benefits from both. Can you just describe a little bit what those benefits are?
Absolutely. And this is the topic that you're going to get hammered the most on by the AGW alarmist crowd. They don't
Yeah,
want you to see any benefit to climate change, warming climates. Agriculture is a perfect example that will capture both of those points. We know that agriculture is better when you have warmer temperatures. It's less susceptible to frosts. It grows better. The growth rates of certain crops are much better at warmer temperatures. And CO2, of course, is plant food. It's what plants take in to do their processes like we take in oxygen. And so at certain levels of CO2 or a CO2 concentration, plants actually do better. And in fact, plants actually do worse when CO2 levels are lower. For example, some studies have showed that plant growth would shut down at around 140 or 150 parts per million in our atmosphere. And during the last ice age, I think we were down around 180 or 200 globally. And
yeah,
so we were at a historical low point. Plants are used to more CO2 and they're just more productive.
yeah. Yeah, I think you and I have a mutual friend in Dr. Craig Idso of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change, or CO2science.org. And Craig has done a lot of study on this, and some of what he has shown is that hundreds, thousands of experiments with CO2 concentration and plant growth have essentially justified the conclusion that for every doubling of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, you get about a 35% increase in plant growth. Plants do better in warmer and cooler temperatures and in wetter and drier soils. They make better use of soil nutrients. They improve their resistance to diseases and pests. And consequently, their range grows. They grow into higher latitudes and lower latitudes than where they were before. They grow into higher altitudes than they were before. They just simply do far, far better. And they also increase their fruit to fiber ratio. And the consequence of all this is that there's more food for everything that eats plants or that eats something that does eat plants. That's a win-win situation. And I think it's a tremendous message that Fred gives about carbon dioxide. It is not a pollutant. It is, as some scientists have called it, it is the elixir of life. And it's just a terrible shame that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled back in Massachusetts versus EPA back in 2007 that the EPA could regulate it as if it were a pollutant. Um, as Fred goes on into chapter 14, he discusses the comparative costs and benefits of mitigation, that is, trying to curtail warming, versus adaptation, or learning to live with a warmer world. Can you run down some of those comparisons for us?
Oh, absolutely. Well, when you think about mitigation, a lot of the strategies that are being proposed, and indeed we've seen implemented over just the last week, is uh, writing off the use of oil and gas in order to rely more on renewables, which are not quite ready for prime time yet. And of course, so so the so the cost of energy is going to increase because you're taking that energy off the market. And when you make something more scarce, the price increases. You add to that the cost of regulations and taxation just increases the prices of goods and services. And again, these are meant to mitigate climate change. And even many of the supporters of these policies say that the US acting alone is not going to make much of a difference. And so, to my mind, I wonder why they're doing this, but they have. And of course, these mitigation efforts, as I pointed out, are very costly. Adaptation isn't as costly because we can got the technologies to adapt to a warmer climate. We know how to build our houses. We know how to build cars that are more energy efficient. And so these things we're already doing, and they don't have an additional cost burden, especially on the poorest parts of society. So adaptation is always the cheaper option. Mitigation is very expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. I often will tell people that there are really just two numbers that they need to know about the Paris Climate Accord, which, of course, President Biden took us back into. um, those two numbers are, first of all, cost, and second, effect. The cost of implementing the Paris Climate Agreement, according to the people who put the agreement together. This is not critics, okay? But according to the people who put it together, the cost would be anywhere from $1 to $2 trillion per year from the year 2030 to the year 2100. That's 70 to 140 trillion dollars over that period. And then the other number is how much warming would be prevented by the emissions cuts achieved by the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. And again, here we are assuming what the very architects of the Paris Agreement think in terms of the warming effect of added CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We're not arguing that these have a lower warming effect or anything like that. We're just taking their ideas for granted. And when you run the numbers using their assumptions, it turns out that the most we would reduce from a full implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement by all the member nations, essentially all the nations in the world, by the year 2100 would be a reduction of global average temperature in the range of 0.3 of 1 degree Fahrenheit. That's pretty close to the margin of error in satellite measure of global average temperature, and it is certainly far too little to have any kind of an impact on any ecosystem or on human well-being. So I'm really not sure why it makes any sense for us to spend 23.3 to 46.6 trillion dollars per tenth of a degree Fahrenheit of temperature reduction in global average temperature, especially when we remember that global average temperature doesn't really make any sense. That doesn't affect anybody. What affects people is the temperature where they are. And am I right, Tony, in understanding that sort of the classical greenhouse warming theory tells us that as we add carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, yes, they will warm things, but the warming will happen primarily toward the poles, not around the equator, primarily in winter, not in summer, and primarily at night, not in the daytime. And as a result, what you'll have is a rising of low temperatures, but very little change in high temperatures. So you won't have significant increase in heat waves and the morbidity and mortality that comes with those, but you will have a very significant decrease in cold snaps and the much higher morbidity and mortality that comes with those. Is that a fair way to sort of summarize the geographic and and seasonal and day and night uh, effects of greenhouse warming?
Absolutely. And to use a phrase that is popular lately, we're circling back to a topic we discussed earlier in that if fewer cold waves, less colder nights will mean less mortality. It'll mean a less volatile climate. And so there's a lot of benefits to a warmer world. And of course, as the temperature warms, whether it's due to CO2 or some other gas or some other process, the physics is going to be the same. And you described it very well. Uh, Less colder air in the polar regions and warmer nights,
Yeah.
not so much warmer days.
Okay. All right. Well, in the final chapter, Dr. Singer argues that rather than fighting global warming, we should be preparing for global cooling. Why is that? How does fighting global warming handicap us in the need to prepare for cooling? And what does Fred Singer recommend as a way to overcome a new little ice age that could be on its way?
Yeah, it's interesting that he talks about this because geoengineering has become a big topic lately. But he shows, or we know, that natural cycles have led to at least 11 ice ages in the past 2 million years. And we might think, oh, that's a very long time. But in the meantime, there's always what we call these little ice ages that happen,
Yeah.
as happened in the middle part of the 1000s millennium. And if you're fighting global warming, you're going to make the physics for these things to occur much easier. And so he suggests not so much fighting global warming, but preparing for any kind of cooling. And again, that goes back to the idea that cooling is more costly in terms of human lives, and it's more costly in terms of adaptation. You have to use a lot more energy to keep people warm than you do to cool people off. And Fred even suggests that if we do go into one of these little ice ages, that the way to do it is through geoengineering in a similar way that we talked about a couple of weeks ago with Bill Gates and putting essentially chalk in the
Yeah.
stratosphere. He suggests putting water vapor in the troposphere. And of course, water vapor forming more clouds will have a cooling effect, especially if you add, had low enough water vapor to create low clouds. But on the other
Right.
hand, if the water vapor creates higher clouds or stays as vapor, that causes a warming, and that could contradict any little ice age.
I see. All right. Well, Dr. Anthony Lupo, Tony, thanks for joining us again on From the Stacks. Do you have some closing words for our viewers?
I would suggest to them to get a hold of this book. It's well worth the read, and it gives you a lot of good information about the climate debate. And as I said before, it's a very honest assessment of the science and the politics of climate change. It's just a well-written book.
All right. Well, thank you very much again. For all our viewers, I'll just remind you that for the month of February, as long as the supply lasts, we will gladly send, as our way of saying thanks when you make a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance, this wonderful new book, the third edition of Hot Talk Cold Science, Global Warming's Unfinished Debate by S. Fred Singer, with assistance in this final edition from David Legates and Anthony Lupo, the latter our guest this evening. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in Hot Talk Cold Science or promo code 21-02 or both, and we will gladly send you a free copy and 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. Well, thanks for joining us again on From the Stacks. Tell your friends about this. Invite them to join you in watching From the Stacks on Tuesday evenings at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, 6 o'clock Central. Until next week, thanks and God bless.